Crystal chandeliers poured golden light over the room, reflecting off every champagne flute and every gleaming piece of jewelry. The marble floor looked like a mirror, where expensive heels glided with calculated steps. The scent of white roses mingled with the soft sound of the orchestra. It was the night of the city's grand charity ball, where millionaires flaunted their wealth under the guise of philanthropy. The conversations were low but sharp, each glance a silent judgment. Here, status wasn't just power, it was social survival. Everything was impeccable, until an unexpected presence walked through the doors. Clara took a deep breath before taking her first step into the ballroom. Her light blue dress, borrowed from a friend, had a subtle sheen, but bore the marks of time. Her heart beat fast, as if each beat echoed in the grandeur of that space. The contrast was overwhelming. While other women wore Italian silk, she discreetly adjusted the worn seam at the hem. She felt the eyes rake over her like invisible blades, some curious, others indifferent, but all aware that she didn't belong in that world. The note in her purse seemed to burn, an invitation that wasn't hers, but that represented a chance to live, for a few hours, a life she'd always dreamed of. She didn't want money or fame, just to feel like she could belong. She knew she was risking a lot. If anyone found out the truth, she could even lose her job. But in that moment, under the crystal lights, fear was less than hope. As she walked through the dining room, Clara noticed how far removed every detail seemed from her reality. The long tables, covered in white linen, boasted silver candlesticks and cut crystal glasses. The clinking of the cutlery formed a symphony of luxury. She remembered the times she had polished similar glasses in the house where she worked, always invisible, never imagining that one day she would touch them as a guest. Now, it was as if she were living a dream, though she knew it could crumble at any moment. On stage, the orchestra changed its tone, leading the couples onto the dance floor. Dresses swirled like colorful waves under the golden lights. Clara stood for a moment, mesmerized, wishing she had the courage to blend in with them. But something held her back. Maybe it was the memory of her position. Maybe it was the almost imperceptible rip in her sleeve. Still, deep inside, a voice whispered, "Just for today. Pretend you belong." As she watched, Clara didn't realize someone was staring at her from across the room. The millionaire, her boss, was there, surrounded by businessmen. He didn't seem to hear the conversations around him, nor did he seem to care about the numbers and contracts they were discussing. His eyes had fixed on her, not on the maid serving coffee in his mansion, but on the young woman who dared enter a world that rejected her. For the first time, something in him wavered. The monumental clock on the wall read 9 o'clock sharp. The hand moved slowly, reminding everyone that this night had an expiration date. To Clara, every minute felt stolen, as if at any moment someone would rip off her guest mask. The feeling of being in forbidden territory was suffocating, but also intoxicating. The more time passed, the more she wished the night would never end. A waiter passed by, offering glasses of sparkling wine. Clara hesitated before taking one. The icy crystal in her hands seemed to betray her imposture. She raised the glass to her lips, trying to hide the tremor. A drop ran down the glass, reflecting the lights of the room like a liquid diamond. Small details reminded her that she was surrounded by a world that didn't accept her, but that, for a moment, allowed her to dream. Whispered conversations began to rise around her. Some women studied her with raised eyebrows as if they already knew something was wrong in her presence. A man whispered in his wife's ear, and she responded with a suppressed laugh. Clara pretended not to notice, but her entire body burned with embarrassment. The dress, which had once seemed magical, now seemed like a fragile disguise about to fall apart. And then, as the music reached its peak, Clara realized every second of that night was a taut thread, ready to snap. The clock continued to tick mercilessly, a cruel reminder that her charade could not last. But deep down, somewhere even she couldn't understand, something told her that this night would not end like all the others. Fate had already begun to move its pieces. Clara grew up in the forgotten corners of the city, on streets where the glow of chandeliers never reached. Her childhood was marked by the smell of bar soap and the constant sound of her mother's sewing machine. She never owned new dresses, only mended ones. She learned early on the art of becoming invisible, speaking softly, walking lightly, taking up as little space as possible. Invisibility was a form of protection, but it was also a prison that night she dared to defy. In the mansion where she worked, Clara knew every detail. She was the one who polished the silverware, who cleaned the marble steps until they shined. She was the one who changed the flower arrangements without ever being noticed. Guests walked past her as if she were part of the furniture. Maid wasn't just her job title, it was society's definition of her. Few knew her name, even fewer bothered to ask. The millionaire, her boss, was a distant man, always impeccable, always busy. Clara served him at dinners, but rarely exchanged a word beyond a polite, "Thank you." To her, he was almost a ghost of flesh and blood, inhabiting an unreachable universe. Sometimes, as she picked up forgotten glasses, Clara observed the emptiness in his eyes. But she never dared imagine what he was thinking. After all, her life was that of an employee, not someone to be seen. However, behind the apron lay dreams no one knew about. Clara liked to write short passages in old notebooks, stories she never shared with anyone. She kept a secret desire to be someone other than the cleaning lady. She dreamed of studying, traveling, maybe even dancing in a ballroom without shame. Each written page was a silent promise to herself. One day, she would be more than the world claimed she was. As she watched the ball, those dreams seemed more distant than ever. The loud laughter, the sparkling jewelry, the men in tailored suits, everything reinforced the gulf between her and them. But there was also a flicker of stubbornness in her gaze. Why were only the rich allowed to feel important? Why should beauty have a price? Clara knew that, somehow, her presence there was a silent rebellion. In the hall, some women were already beginning to whisper among themselves. Clara felt the weight of their gazes, but kept her head held high. She was tired of living doubled over, constantly apologizing for existing. Maybe it was just for one night, but here she wasn't a servant. She was a guest. Even if it was a lie, even if it was temporary, she clung to this illusion, like someone holding on to the last thread before falling. There was, however, one detail that worried her deeply. The dress she was wearing had a fragile seam on the side. She had tried to reinforce it, but she knew any sudden movement could tear it. Every step was calculated, every gesture rehearsed to disguise her vulnerability. The fear of being unmasked was real, but mixed with the adrenaline of daring. It was like walking on thin ice. Dangerous, but exciting. Across the room, Clara noticed groups of people watching her with increasing attention. Some looked suspiciously, others with malice. A young man chuckled softly, pointing in her direction. A blush rose to her cheeks, but she took a deep breath. She wouldn't let them see her weakness. Even though her heart felt like it was about to leap out of her chest, Clara lifted her chin and continued walking, as if she had nothing to fear. Within her, however, a silent battle raged. Every memory of past humiliation rose like a ghost. Schoolmates who mocked her attire, neighbors who looked at her with pity, clients at the mansion who treated her as if invisible. Her entire life had been reduced to serving, but tonight she refused to be just that. And it was in that moment of silent resistance that her eyes met the millionaire's again. He didn't look away. Clara felt a shiver run through her body, unsure of why. For a moment, she was no longer invisible. But what that meant was yet to come, and it would change their lives forever. Ricardo Moreau was the name that graced magazine headlines, newspaper covers, and gala invitations. Owner of a fortune built through risky investments and cold negotiations, he was the kind of man everyone admired, but few truly knew. His presence at the ball wasn't out of love for charity, but out of strategy. There, every handshake was an implicit contract, every toast a political ploy. He wore an impeccable smile, but behind it lay a silence no one heard. Ricardo mastered the art of social distancing. He knew exactly when to laugh, when to compliment, when to feign interest. But the truth was, when he returned to his mansion, the silence of the hallways engulfed him. Dinners alone, sleepless nights, the weight of his own image haunted him. The millionaire who seemed to have it all was, in reality, a prisoner of luxurious solitude. No one dared see beyond his wealth. And he had already given up on revealing the man behind his name. That night, the ballroom reflected everything he knew. Artificial glitter, empty words, alliances forged out of convenience. The clinking of glasses seemed deafening. The exaggerated laughter of the guests was an off-key music that no longer amused him. While everyone else indulged in vanity, Ricardo wondered if his entire life would be nothing more than a series of parties and contracts. The emptiness inside him grew like an endless echo. Then he saw her. Across the room, a figure stood out from the rest. Clara. Not the maid who prepared breakfast in the morning, but a woman who somehow dared to exist among those who pretended to be superior. Her eyes, despite their insecurity, held something Ricardo hadn't seen in years. Authenticity. A glimmer of truth amidst a multitude of masks. This disconcerted him. He couldn't tell if what he felt was curiosity, compassion, or simply hunger for something real. But suddenly, all the faces around him seemed blurred. Clara was the only clear point in his vision. Her simple dress, her restrained gestures, even her vulnerability contrasted with the ostentatious world he was accustomed to. The scene began to crack his own mask. A partner approached to talk business, but Ricardo barely heard. He pretended to pay attention, nodded, even toasted mechanically. But inside, he was torn. Part of him said he shouldn't get involved, that it would be dangerous. After all, if anyone found out he was paying attention to a maid, a scandal would be inevitable. The other part, however, burned with the desire to cross the room and ask her what she was doing there. As he watched, he remembered the first time Clara entered his mansion. She was just another employee, hired by referral. But over time, he'd noticed little things. The way she handled objects with care, as if each piece had value beyond money. Her respectful silence, never heavy. Her steady gaze, even when she was serving. Now, seeing her at the ball, Ricardo realized he'd always underestimated her. A tightness gripped his chest. How many people in his life had he ignored? How many stories had passed him by without him noticing? Perhaps the greatest treasure he possessed was right in front of him, and he had never seen it. This idea disturbed him deeply, as if forcing him to look into a mirror he had always avoided. For a moment, Ricardo felt like throwing away his crystal glass, ripping off his tie, and leaving that suffocating room. But he knew he couldn't. His life was built on appearances, and a single crack could bring down the entire empire he maintained. Even so, he couldn't look away from Clara. The risk of revealing himself seemed small compared to his urgent need to feel alive. And as he fought this urge, one question consumed him. How long could he keep the mask on? Because if he continued to watch Clara, he knew the answer might come sooner than he thought, and it would change everything. Here's also a natural call to subscribe to the channel. If you think this story is already intense, just wait until you see what comes next. Subscribe so you don't miss the next story. The invitation to the ball wasn't from Clara. It belonged to Anna, her childhood friend who worked as a waitress in another mansion in the city. Anna had been invited to the event, but embarrassed, decided not to go. "This isn't my world, Clara, but perhaps it can be yours, even if only for one night," she said, handing over the golden envelope. Clara hesitated. The idea was too risky, but silently, she felt her heart race at the chance to experience something beyond the routine. The paper was heavy, delicate, with the Moreau family crest printed in gold. Clara held it as if it were a winning lottery ticket. Every curve of the letters seemed to mock her boldness. How could she believe someone like her could enter a millionaire's ball? Still, she tucked the invitation away in a small wooden box, as if hiding a precious secret. That week, the tension grew. Each workday, Clara cleaned the halls of the mansion where the ball would soon take place. As chandeliers were polished and carpets were laid, she wondered if she would have the courage to use the invitation. The fear of being discovered was as real as the temptation to experience something unique. The dilemma kept her awake at night. One night, in front of the cracked mirror in her room, Clara tried on the borrowed dress. light blue, worn at the shoulders, with small stitches reinforcing the edges. It wasn't luxurious, but it was the best she had. She combed her hair as simply as possible and, for a moment, almost believed she was someone else. A guest. A woman worthy of being surrounded by crystal and music. A lie too beautiful to ignore. But her conscience weighed heavily. What if she got caught? What if her boss saw her and kicked her out not only of the ball, but of the mansion where she worked? Clara knew her life depended on that job. Every penny she earned went to pay overdue bills and buy medicine for her mother. Still, the flame of boldness burned brighter than fear. Perhaps because, deep down, she was already tired of being invisible. The afternoon before the ball, Anna appeared again. "Clara, are you sure? This world is cruel. If they notice anything wrong, they'll laugh at you mercilessly." Clara swallowed hard, but replied firmly, "They've laughed all my life. I'd rather they laugh while I'm trying to live than keep hiding." Anna hugged her friend, tears in her eyes, and handed her a simple silver brooch to complete her dress. "Take this as courage." When the big day arrived, Clara hid the invitation inside her worn purse. Each step toward the mansion felt like a journey into another universe. Her heart was pounding so loudly she feared the security guards would hear. But to her surprise, when she showed the golden envelope, no one questioned her. The door opened, and the world that had always been forbidden was suddenly before her. The hall greeted her with a whirlwind of lights and sounds. Clara almost forgot her nervousness at the beauty surrounding her. But deep down, she knew the paper she carried was a lie, and any carelessness could cost her everything. The note was her key, but also a time bomb ready to explode. As she walked among the guests, Clara repeated to herself, "Keep calm, walk slowly, smile." She was an actress improvising on a gilded stage. The problem was that, unlike in the theater, here the audience had no compassion. If they discovered the deception, she wouldn't just be exposed, she would be destroyed. And yet, with all the risks hanging over her head, Clara felt something new within her: freedom. However short, that night was hers. And without realizing it, she had just begun a story that would change not only her destiny, but also that of the most powerful man in the room. The hall was in frenzy when Clara walked through the entrance. Every detail seemed magnified in her mind: the intense glow of the chandeliers, the music echoing in soft waves, the scent of flowers and spices mingling in the air. But what disconcerted her most were the eyes. Eyes everywhere. Eyes that assessed her, judged her, measured her presence. Some curious, others malicious. She felt as if she were exposed under an invisible spotlight. The first glances were accompanied by whispers. An elegant couple stopped talking for a moment just to follow her with their eyes. A woman in a gold dress looked her up and down, wrinkling her nose with disdain. Clara tried to ignore it, but a blush rose to her face. It was as if each person could see not only the hidden rip in her dress, but also the lie the invitation represented. Despite the pressure, Clara took a deep breath and kept walking. Her footsteps echoed softly on the marble, while the jewels and suits glittered around her. Every movement seemed rehearsed, but inside, she was fighting a battle against fear. "Smile," she told herself. "Act like you have a right to be here." And for a few seconds, she succeeded. A waiter passed by offering glasses of champagne, and Clara took one. The simple gesture made her seem part of the scene. As she raised the glass, she noticed a few glances shift, as if, for a moment, they believed she belonged. That gave her the strength to continue. But soon a group of young people chuckled quietly upon noticing the simplicity of the fabric of her dress. Clara looked away, swallowing her pride. Across the room, Ricardo watched her silently. Every glance that fell on Clara was like a blow to him too. Seeing her struggling to stand her ground amidst so many venomous mouths awakened something in him, a mixture of indignation and admiration. This wasn't the same young woman who served him coffee every morning. She was someone who, despite her fragility, exuded courage. Guests gathered in small circles, exchanging subtle comments. "Who is she?" some asked. "I don't remember seeing her before." The mystery surrounding Clara only heightened curiosity, but instead of arousing sympathy, this curiosity turned to judgment. In that world, being unknown was already a crime. Clara tried to distract herself by admiring the mansion's flower arrangements and architectural details. Every corner seemed laden with luxury, yet at the same time, cold. Nothing there was meant to welcome. Everything served to separate. She felt small, but not defeated. With each dismissive glance, she became more convinced that she had to stand firm. One detail, however, made her apprehensive. A tiny tear was beginning to discreetly open on the side of her dress, right next to the reinforced seam. Almost imperceptible, but dangerous. She subtly adjusted the fabric, trying to disguise it, but she knew she couldn't hide it forever. Her heart raced. If that secret came to light, the night would end in ruin. As she hid her tension, Clara noticed something she hadn't expected. There were also different looks. An older man smiled kindly as she passed. A young waitress stared at her with admiration, as if silently saying, "You're brave." These small gestures warmed her. Perhaps she wasn't completely alone. But the hall was unforgiving, and soon hostile stares took over again. The suppressed laughter of some guests already seemed louder than the music. Clara took a deep breath, holding her head high. She didn't know it yet, but every step she took was also a challenge to the system that made her invisible. And without realizing it, she was attracting more and more attention, including that of the person who would change her destiny forever. The orchestra's music grew louder as Clara decided to cross the room toward the dance floor. Each step felt like a battle against insecurity. She discreetly adjusted the side of her dress, aware of the fragile seam. The fabric creaked softly, a silent warning that it was about to give way. Even so, Clara maintained her posture, trying to project confidence. But inside, she felt like glass about to shatter. As she stopped near the dance floor, a wave of movement around her jostled her slightly. The collision with another guest was enough to rip the seam. A tiny tear appeared in the side, barely noticeable at first. Clara immediately felt the fabric give, and her blood ran cold. There was no denying it. Her disguise was unraveling before everyone's eyes. She turned quickly, trying to hide the tear with her arm. The gesture, however, drew even more attention. A woman in an emerald green dress gave her a piercing look, followed by a cynical smile. Clara realized the first spark of humiliation had been ignited. Her heart hammered in her chest, racing like the beat of music. With each movement, the tear widened, slowly but inexorably. Clara walked more slowly. Fearing that a single long stride would be enough to reveal the deception, the room seemed to shrink, and all eyes seemed to converge on her. The sensation of being stripped bare before a crowd grew stronger by the second. Trying to buy time, Clara approached a table and pretended to observe the flower arrangements. She adjusted her purse against her side, like a shield. But when she lowered it slightly to disguise the tear, she heard an unmistakable sound, the fabric giving way once more. Panic rose in her throat. She was on the verge of collapse. Across the room, a small group was already whispering, pointing discreetly. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she knew they were about her. A muffled laugh escaped the guests, cutting through the air like a blade. With each passing second, the threat went from invisible to public. Ricardo, amidst his partners, noticed the tension in Clara's face. He observed every nervous gesture, every failed attempt to hide the problem. He still didn't know why, but something was wrong, and it kept him fixated on her. For the first time that night, he completely ignored the business going on around him. The entire world melted into the background. Clara, however, felt trapped. There was no way out. Running away would draw even more attention. Remaining still was impossible. She was trapped in a cruel game where every second increased the risk of total exposure. The once majestic hall was now transformed into an arena. As the orchestra reached a vibrant crescendo, Clara knew she no longer had control over what would happen. The dress, her only passport to that world, was becoming her sentence. Each broken thread was a step closer to shame. And deep down, Clara was bitterly aware. It wouldn't just be a tear in her dress. It would be the definitive shattering of the illusion she had built. And when that happened, the cruel laughter of the elite would show no mercy. The orchestra's music grew louder as Clara decided to cross the room toward the dance floor. Each step felt like a battle against insecurity. She discreetly adjusted the side of her dress, aware of the fragile seam. The fabric creaked softly, a silent warning that it was about to give way. Even so, Clara maintained her posture, trying to project confidence, but inside, she felt like glass about to shatter. As she stopped near the dance floor, a wave of movement around her jostled her slightly. The collision with another guest was enough to rip the seam. A tiny tear appeared in the side, barely noticeable at first. Clara immediately felt the fabric give, and her blood ran cold. There was no denying it. Her disguise was unraveling before everyone's eyes. She turned quickly, trying to hide the tear with her arm. The gesture, however, drew even more attention. A woman in an emerald green dress gave her a piercing look, followed by a cynical smile. Clara realized the first spark of humiliation had been ignited. Her heart hammered in her chest, racing like the beat of music. With each movement, the tear widened, slowly but inexorably. Clara walked more slowly, fearing that a single long step would be enough to reveal the fraud. The room seemed to shrink, and all eyes seemed to converge on her. The feeling of being stripped naked in front of a crowd grew with each passing second. Trying to buy time, Clara approached a table and pretended to observe the flower arrangements. She adjusted her purse against her side like a shield, but when she lowered it slightly to disguise the tear, she heard an unmistakable sound, the fabric giving way once more. Panic rose in her throat. She was on the verge of collapse. Across the room, a small group was already whispering, pointing discreetly. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she knew they were about her. A muffled laugh escaped the guests, cutting through the air like a blade. With each passing second, the threat went from invisible to public. Ricardo, amidst his partners, noticed the tension in Clara's face. He observed every nervous gesture, every failed attempt to hide the problem. He still didn't know why, but something was wrong, and it kept him fixated on her. For the first time that night, he completely ignored the business going on around him. The entire world melted into the background. Clara, however, felt trapped. There was no way out. Running away would draw even more attention. Remaining still was impossible. She was trapped in a cruel game where every second increased the risk of total exposure. The once majestic hall was now transformed into an arena. As the orchestra reached a vibrant crescendo, Clara knew she no longer had control over what would happen. The dress, her only passport to that world, was becoming her sentence. Each thread that broke was a step closer to shame, and deep down, Clara was bitterly aware it wouldn't just be a tear in her dress. It would be the definitive shattering of the illusion she had built. And when that happened, the cruel laughter of the elite would show no mercy. The hall seemed to breathe along with the orchestra, but for Clara, the sound of the music was gone. All she could hear was the frantic beating of her own heart and the dry sound of the fabric giving way a little more. A shiver ran down her spine as she realized that some of the gazes were no longer just curious, but cruel. They knew, and they were waiting for the right moment to strike. Then it happened. As she turned to leave the table, Clara felt her dress rip more visibly. It wasn't a loud bang, but to her it sounded like a thunder amidst the silence. A young woman to his left widened her eyes, covering her mouth in mock surprise. Immediately afterward, the inevitable. The first laugh. Low, venomous, cutting. The sound spread like wildfire. Another guest laughed, then two more, and within seconds Clara was surrounded by whispers and muffled laughter. It was as if the entire room had discovered a joke of which she alone was the target. Each laugh was an arrow pierced through her dignity. Her eyes stung, but she refused to cry. A group of women approached, led by the one in the emerald green dress, the same one who had observed her earlier. "How daring," one of them muttered, her contempt unmistakably evident, "coming to a ball like that in a rag like that." The comment, spoken in a low tone, was loud enough to echo like a public judgment. Clara felt her legs weaken. She tried to protect herself by positioning her purse against her side, but it was no use. The image of the infiltrator was formed. Some men laughed openly, without any shame. Others watched silently, but with looks of superiority, as if the scene were a spectacle designed to entertain them. Clara was, in that moment, a spectacle of humiliation. Each laugh grew more cruel. It was as if the tear in her dress was proof that she should never have walked through those doors. Shame burned her skin, and the feeling of helplessness crushed her. Yet deep inside her, something stubbornly resisted. A voice said, "Don't lower your head. Don't give them the pleasure of seeing you broken." Across the room, Ricardo watched the scene with his chest burning. He saw the looks of contempt, heard the laughter, felt the cruelty vibrating in the air. For the first time in years, anger overcame him. This wasn't just his employee being humiliated. This was a person being torn apart in front of everyone. And somehow, he felt responsible. Clara, at the center of the trial, found strength in small gestures. She straightened her shoulders, even though her heart was in ruins. She forced a discreet smile, as if she could defy the mockery with dignity. This simple act confused some of those laughing, but angered the cruelest even more. The laughter intensified. The hall had become an arena, and she was the target of the spectacle. She had nowhere to run. To flee would be to admit defeat. To stay would be to resist, even if only for a few seconds. Time seemed to slow down. Every look, every laugh, every whisper, becoming a stone in her direction. Clara was alone against everyone. But fate was already preparing its turn. Because just as the humiliation reached its peak, Ricardo stepped forward. The expression on his face left no doubt. Something was about to change, and no one in that room would emerge unscathed from what came next. Ricardo remained motionless, but inside a storm raged. He saw Clara surrounded by laughter and cruel looks, and every second of his inaction made him feel complicit in the scene. The image of her trying to protect her torn dress with dignity struck him deeply. She wasn't just an employee. She was a woman fighting against an entire system that crushed her mercilessly. And he, with all his power, remained silent. His gaze swept the room. The guests were too engrossed in their humiliation to notice the fury in his eyes. To them, Clara was entertainment, a mistake to be exposed. But for Ricardo, she was becoming something greater, a mirror reflecting all the falseness of that environment. Suddenly he found himself questioning what he had truly built throughout his life. The laughter echoed like hammer blows in his mind. Ricardo felt his throat close with indignation. How many times had he ignored similar situations? How many times had he preferred the comfort of indifference rather than intervene? That night, he realized that his mask of a powerful man was also made of cowardice, and it ate at him. While everyone laughed, he observed the details no one else noticed. Clara's hands trembling slightly, her teary eyes that she insisted on keeping steady, her shoulders straight despite her embarrassment. There was a quiet, almost defiant strength there, and that strength ignited something inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time, the urge to act. One of his partners approached, trying to get his attention with a business proposal. Ricardo barely heard. His mind was elsewhere, focused on Clara. "Not now," he replied, his tone dry and surprising. For the first time that night, he wasn't concerned with contracts, numbers, or strategies. What mattered was happening right before his eyes. But the decision wasn't simple. Ricardo knew that any action would have consequences. If he defended Clara, his public image could be questioned. The newspapers would speculate, rivals would laugh, and partners would bother. The price would be high. And yet, watching her stand alone against everyone, the price of not acting seemed even greater. He remembered the first time he saw her in the mansion. Clara, holding a silver tray, discreetly averted her gaze to the library books, as if longing to touch them. He remembered how she tended the flowers, arranging them patiently. Now, seeing her in the center of the room, he realized he had ignored her humanity for too long. The tear in the dress was just a detail. The real scandal was the collective cruelty, and Ricardo knew it. He felt the shame of everyone present falling upon him, as if he were complicit in every laugh. With each moment, his anger grew, along with his determination. Something had to be done, and he would do it. Clara, on the other side, still didn't realize she was being watched so intensely. To her, Ricardo was just another millionaire among many. But in that moment, he became the only one capable of changing the course of that night. His eyes never left hers, and within her, a decision began to form. And then, while the room still vibrated with laughter, Ricardo took a deep breath and took the first step toward Clara. No one noticed yet, but that small, silent movement would be the beginning of a turning point that would change everything. Ricardo walked slowly through the ballroom, each step heavy as if carrying a ton of invisible expectations and judgments. With every meter he got closer to Clara, his mind screamed in opposite directions. A cold voice whispered, "Keep up appearances. Go back to your place." But another, more intense, roared inside him. "She doesn't deserve this. Do something." The laughter continued to echo, cruel, like a soundtrack of contempt. Ricardo felt like each laugh was an accusation against him. He, who had always prided himself on being strong, now found himself fragile when faced with a decision. "I knew that if I intervened I would be questioned, but if I remained inactive, I would lose something even more valuable. Self-respect." His heart was racing, an uncomfortable contrast to the impeccable calm of his exterior. On the outside, he stood erect, his shoulders firm, his gaze serious. But inside, he was shattered into 1,000 pieces. The masks he had cultivated for years, of coldness, of power, of indifference, were now about to crack. All because of a young woman who dared to be seen. He remembered his father's words, spoken in his youth. "Men like us cannot afford weakness. Our power depends on the distance we maintain." Ricardo had grown up believing this, shaping his life as an unassailable fortress. But looking at Clara, humiliated and courageous at the same time, he questioned whether that was truly strength or just cowardice. As he approached, he noticed the shifting gazes. Some guests had already noticed him walking toward Clara. The laughter faded for a moment, replaced by curiosity. Ricardo felt the weight of this attention like blades on his skin. One wrong step and he would be judged along with her. But for once, it didn't seem to matter. Clara looked up and their eyes met. It was a silent shock. She hadn't expected anything from him. But in her gaze was a silent, almost imperceptible plea. "Don't leave me alone." Ricardo felt his stomach churn. The decision, until then an internal battle, now became urgent. There was no more time for hesitation. The orchestra continued playing, oblivious to the tension gripping the room. Each note sounded like an invisible timer. Time was running out. If he didn't act now, Clara's humiliation would become a permanent scar. Ricardo knew that in a few hours everyone would forget the episode, but she would never forget. Still, fear held him back. Fear of breaking the unspoken rules of the elite. Fear of becoming a target of ridicule. Fear of being seen as a man who chose his heart over reason. The price would be high. But as he looked at Clara again, he realized the true cost lay in not acting. His body had already decided before his mind. His heart pushed where logic hesitated. Ricardo took a deep breath, the dense air of the hall burning his lungs, and finally he realized it wasn't just about her. It was about him, about who he wanted to be from then on. With that thought, he quickened his steps. The entire room was beginning to notice, and the man who had always lived hidden behind a mask was about to reveal his true face. The room seemed frozen in time when Ricardo finally approached Clara. The laughter, though still present, had diminished in intensity. It was as if everyone was waiting to see what he would do. Clara, for her part, didn't look away. Her eyes were teary, but there was an unexpected firmness in them, a silent refusal to completely give in to humiliation. This detail disarmed him completely. She calmly straightened her dress, even though she knew the tear was still visible. The gesture, simple and courageous, had more impact on Ricardo than any words. He noticed that Clara didn't bow, even though she was the target of collective scorn. Her dignity ripped through her mask faster than any insult could. For the first time in years, Ricardo felt ashamed of who he was. His entire life had been built on appearances, the rehearsed smile, the calculated words, the absolute control of his image. But in front of Clara, all of this seemed fragile, empty. He wasn't looking at a maid, nor an intruder at his ball. He was looking at a woman who, with nothing but courage, exposed the falseness of everyone around her, including his own. A brief silence fell between them. Clara didn't ask for help, didn't reach out, didn't plead. But her erect posture, her chin lifted, her refusal to lower her eyes, this was more powerful than any plea. Ricardo felt the cold marble floor beneath his feet, but within him burned a fire that threatened to consume all the masks he had worn until then. One of the nearby men, noticing the scene, laughed out loud and commented, "Look, even the host seems intrigued by her outfit." His tone was venomous, full of mockery. Ricardo, normally adept at ignoring provocations, felt anger explode within him. This wasn't just against Clara, it was against everything he believed he could control. Clara looked away for a moment, biting her lower lip to hold back tears. That small gesture was the final blow to Ricardo's wall. He saw in that instant not only the young woman being humiliated, but also all the years he himself had hidden behind coldness and silence, and he realized the mask could no longer remain. Taking a deep breath, he straightened his shoulders. Every muscle in his body trembled with the imminent choice. The decision had already been made, even before he realized it. The entire room seemed to be waiting for his next move, like spectators at a play. Ricardo, however, knew this wasn't a performance. It was his life that was about to change. As he looked at Clara, he felt a strange liberation. The weight of appearances seemed to dissolve. For the first time, the opinions of others didn't matter. The only gaze that mattered at that moment was hers. And he wanted, above all, not to disappoint her. The guests whispered, some laughing, others shocked. But Ricardo no longer heard them. The sound in the hall faded to silence. Time slowed, and the only thing that existed was the woman before him, wounded but intact in her dignity. And it was in that moment, faced with the collective laughter and the cruelty of others, that Ricardo let his mask slip. The cold and distant millionaire gave way to the man who finally decided to act. The next step he would take toward Clara would change everything, for him, for her, and for everyone in that room. Ricardo took another step forward, and this time everyone noticed. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. The laughter, which was still echoing, slowly died away, replaced by a curious and uncomfortable silence. Clara felt her heart race even faster. She didn't understand what he wanted, but the steady look he gave her conveyed something no one else in the room dared to offer: respect. The millionaire stood before her, imposing but not arrogant. His presence alone was enough to silence voices. The guests looked at each other in bewilderment. "What is he doing?" someone murmured in the background. Clara, her dress torn, stared back in disbelief. She had never imagined that this man, always distant, would stand beside her in public. Ricardo extended his hand. The gesture was simple, yet powerful. The entire room seemed to vibrate with his audacity. "May I have this dance?" he asked, his voice low but firm enough for many to hear. Clara froze for a moment. The eyes on her were burning like fire, but there was something even more intense in the air, the unexpected courage emanating from him. A collective murmur ran through the room. It was unthinkable. The host, the most influential man present, offering his hand to a woman who had just been humiliated. The faces ranged from shock to indignation to pure curiosity. Some tried to hide their discomfort. Others could no longer contain their surprise. The balance of power in that room was beginning to crumble. Clara hesitated, but then something inside her spoke louder. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the need to prove she wasn't broken. She held his hand firmly, even though her fingers trembled. A shiver ran through her body the instant the touch happened. The music, previously drowned out by the din of whispers, became audible again. Ricardo led her to the center of the dance floor. With each step, people moved away, making space as if witnessing a historic event. Clara felt the eyes on her back, but for the first time that night, she didn't lower her head. With him by her side, it was as if she'd gained invisible armor. As they stood beneath the light of the main chandelier, the orchestra resumed a slow, almost ceremonial melody. Ricardo gently placed his hand on her waist, and the two began to dance. The hall, which minutes before had erupted in laughter, now watched in absolute silence. The gesture transformed humiliation into defiance. Some guests couldn't accept it. "This is absurd," a woman whispered loudly. Others, however, remained mesmerized by the scene, unable to react. The charity ball, which should have been just another night of ostentation, was turning into a spectacle of social disruption. Ricardo, without saying a word, had made the boldest choice of his life. Clara, still stunned, felt a mixture of shame and gratitude. Each step in the dance was a reminder that she was not alone. This man, who had so often seemed distant, now truly saw her, and that simple fact changed everything. The room, suspended between shock and silence, awaited what would come next. Ricardo knew the dance was only the beginning. There was still much more to be said, and he was ready to face the consequences. When Ricardo took Clara by the hand and led her to the center of the room, time seemed to stand still. The orchestra obediently softened the melody, as if it too understood the weight of the moment. The guests, previously laughing and murmuring, were now completely silent. The sound of glasses, the clinking of cutlery, even the footsteps of the waiters, everything ceased. All that remained was the unlikely scene of a millionaire dancing with the woman everyone had ridiculed. Clara felt every gaze boring into her skin. The silence was so thick it seemed to scream louder than the laughter from minutes ago. But when she looked up at Ricardo, she found a steady calm in him. He guided her gently, as if to say, "You are not alone." That unexpected reassurance gave her the strength not to fall apart. The people around were stunned. Some watched with indignation, others with fascination. No one dared interrupt, but everyone was aware they were witnessing something out of the ordinary. The silence wasn't just an absence of sound. It was anticipation, curiosity, even discomfort. The elite, accustomed to laughing at those they considered inferior, now didn't know how to react. With each step of the dance, Clara felt as if she were regaining something that had been stripped from her, her dignity. The torn dress still embarrassed her, but Ricardo's posture transformed it into a symbol of resistance. It was no longer just an exposed flaw. It was proof that she had dared to be there, and that kind of made her stronger. Ricardo also felt the weight of silence. His associates and acquaintances watched him, shocked. He knew he would lose allies, that he would be the target of criticism and perhaps even scandal. But in that moment, none of that mattered. For the first time in years, he felt truly alive. The mask had fallen, and in its place was just a man standing up for what was right. One of the guests couldn't contain it and whispered loud enough for some to hear, "This is unacceptable." The comment broke the tension, but not in the way expected. Instead of laughing again, many looked away, embarrassed. It was as if Ricardo's gesture had exposed collective cruelty, and now no one wanted to be remembered as an accomplice. Clara was surprised by every detail. The warmth of his hand on her waist, the steady rhythm, his unwavering gaze. It was as if the ball, once a gilded prison, had become the stage for something greater, a challenge to the logic of exclusion. And, unexpectedly, she was the protagonist. The silence, however, remained oppressive. The sound of the orchestra's strings echoed through the hall like a solemn whisper. Every second seemed like a prelude to an explosion, of applause, of protests, or something even greater. Suspense hung over everyone. Ricardo felt he needed to go further. Dancing was only the first act. The room was in suspense, awaiting the outcome. He knew he couldn't back down. The silence wouldn't last forever, and would soon be broken by whoever tried to regain control. The choice was before him: remain silent or speak out. And as he twirled with Clara beneath the glow of the chandelier, Ricardo decided. The dance would end in words, and those words would be impossible to ignore. The music, slow and delicate, enveloped the room as Ricardo firmly led Clara. It was impossible not to notice the contrast: the most powerful man in the room dancing with the woman everyone had ridiculed minutes before. The guests watched, motionless, as if witnessing a forbidden scene. The dense silence only heightened the impact of each step they took. Clara could hardly believe what was happening. The warmth of his hand supported her waist, and although her heart was pounding wildly, her feet kept pace. Each turn seemed to erase, little by little, the cruel laughter that still echoed in her mind. It was as if the dance were a silent way of returning her to the place she had always been denied, the place of being seen. Ricardo kept his gaze fixed on her, completely ignoring the faces around him. The world could fall apart, but he wouldn't look away. For the first time, it didn't matter what others thought. The gesture was for her, and for himself. He was no longer the untouchable millionaire. He was simply a man choosing courage over fear. With each turn, Clara felt the torn dress shift, reminding her of the fragility of the situation. But strangely, it no longer paralyzed her. The flaw, once a source of shame, now became part of her story. If they were looking, let them look. There was no longer any way to erase the fact that the host had chosen her to dance. Some guests began to whisper, unable to contain their discomfort. "Has he gone mad?" asked a man in a gray suit. "He's debasing himself in front of everyone." But others remained silent, fascinated by the scene. It was impossible to deny the force of the gesture. The room, accustomed to dictating rules of exclusion, was now forced to witness an unprecedented breach of protocol. Ricardo noticed the whispers but didn't hesitate. His hand gently guided Clara as if she were the only person in the room. The rhythm of the music seemed to match the rhythm of their hearts, creating an invisible bubble where only they existed. With each step, he felt his own mask crumble. Clara, still frightened, began to relax. It wasn't just a dance. It was a gesture of redemption, a gesture that said, "You're not alone. I see you." Her teary eyes met his, and in that instant, everything around her disappeared. She no longer felt ashamed, only the strange sensation of finally being recognized. Outside this bubble, however, discomfort grew. Expressions ranged from indignation to confusion and even envy. Each second prolonged the tension. What should have been a simple dance turned into a silent earthquake, shaking the social foundations of the elite gathered in that hall. As the music reached its climax, Ricardo twirled Clara one last time, elegantly. The entire room held its breath. The gesture was grand, almost theatrical, but unlike the usual ostentation of that setting, there was no falseness here. It was pure defiance. And when the dance ended, the silence returned with even more force. Everyone waited. Ricardo knew that his next move would define not only that night, but also the course of his life. The hall, which minutes before had vibrated with music and laughter, now boiled with stifled murmurs. The dance had ended, but Ricardo's gesture remained suspended in the air like a newly struck bolt of lightning. The discomfort was palpable. "Scandal," murmured a woman wearing a pearl necklace, fanning herself frantically. He dragged his own name through the mud. A businessman in a dark suit leaned toward his colleagues, his voice laced with venom. "If he thinks he can play around with the rules of our society, he's lost. Money buys luxury, but not respect." The others nodded, their faces set in disapproval. It was as if Ricardo's gesture had opened a fissure in an empire of conventions, and everyone feared it would widen. Clara felt the stares like invisible daggers. They were no longer laughter, but silent condemnations, even more cruel. The wound left by the tear in her dress now seemed small compared to the new accusation. Daring to exist alongside him. The elite couldn't bear the idea of a simple woman, a servant, standing in the center of the dance floor under the main spotlight. Ricardo didn't move an inch. His calm expression was a wall against the collective indignation. He knew the price: broken alliances, closed doors, scandalous headlines. But for the first time in years, that price seemed fair. It was as if he had broken the invisible chains that imprisoned him to the perfect image others expected of him. Timid attempts to restore normalcy emerged. One guest raised his glass and announced in a stilted tone, "Let us remember that tonight is for charity." But the words died in the air, hollow, fragile. The truth was inescapable. The elite's pride was wounded, and the blood of that pride still dripped from the contorted expressions around them. Clara maintained her posture. Her knees trembled. Her heart felt ready to burst, but she lifted her chin. Not because she felt strong, but because she knew that to give in would be to surrender completely. At Ricardo's side, she found the invisible support she needed. A single look from him was enough. Firm, protective, defiant. The guests were divided. Some stared at her with hatred, as if her presence were a personal affront. Others, silent, seemed to admire her courage, though they would never dare show it in public. The tension grew like a taut rope about to snap. It was then that a young woman, unable to bear the silence, blurted out venomously, "He may dress you in silk, but you will never be one of us." The words cut Clara like a blade. But instead of making her falter, they rekindled something dormant: pride, resistance. For the first time, she wanted to respond. She held back, but within her, a flame of the answer that was yet to come flared. Ricardo heard the sentence. The venom coursed through him, but instead of reacting with fury, he closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and opened them again with a decision engraved in them. This wouldn't be just a dance. He wouldn't allow the night to end. Like a poisonous whisper, the entire hall became an invisible arena, divided between tradition and rupture. And in the center stood Clara and Ricardo, two bodies alone against an empire of masks. But without them realizing it, the climax was already approaching like an inevitable wave. The room seemed ready to explode. Venomous murmurs drifted between the tables, contemptuous glances multiplied, and the judgmental air was suffocating. Clara stood erect, her eyes fixed on nothing, trying not to collapse. But Ricardo knew. It wasn't enough to have saved her from humiliation. He needed to go further. He needed to crush, once and for all, the venom dripping from the mouths of that elite. He let go of Clara's hand for a moment, climbing onto the small step beside the orchestra. The gesture immediately drew everyone's attention. The music stopped, the waiters froze in place, and the hall fell into a heavy silence. The host of the ball, the man everyone revered, now stared into every face present. There were no smiles. There was only resolve. Ricardo raised a crystal glass. The light from the chandelier reflected off the golden liquid, scattering sparkles throughout the room. His voice, when it finally echoed, was calm, firm, and sharp as a blade. "Many here believe that true elegance lies in silk, gold, and diamonds. But I tell you, true greatness is not worn, it is carried in the heart." The guests glanced at each other uneasily. Some coughed, trying to hide their embarrassment. Others, chins held high, kept their gazes cool, as if refusing to be affected by those words. But it was impossible to ignore them. The entire room seemed to vibrate with the weight of the revelation. Ricardo then turned to Clara. Their eyes met, and in that instant, there was no longer master and maid, millionaire and maid. There were just two souls exposed before a hostile audience. He raised his glass higher and declared, "This night will not be remembered for the impeccable dresses or the expensive rings. It will be remembered for the courage of those who dared to stand, even when everyone tried to bring them down." An indignant murmur ran through the room, but Ricardo didn't back down. On the contrary, he took a step forward as if defying every glance that met his gaze. They laughed at her because her dress ripped. They laughed at her because they believe value lies in the fabric and not in the soul. But I tell you, every laugh echoes only as proof of one's own pettiness. His firm voice rent the silence like thunder. Clara, motionless, felt tears welling up in her eyes. But they weren't from shame. They were from something she'd never experienced. Being defended. Not as a servant, not as someone inferior, but as a person. For the first time in her life, someone with power reached out not to crush her, but to elevate her. Some guests couldn't take it anymore and left, muttering insults as they went. Others remained, embarrassed, lacking the courage to react. A few discreetly lowered their eyes in respect. The order of that world of appearances began to crumble before the courage of a single man. Ricardo took Clara's hand again. His gesture was simple yet symbolic. The untouchable millionaire, who had always lived behind a mask, had chosen to expose himself to protect someone invisible to the eyes of others. And in doing so, he not only transformed her, he also transformed himself. And so, under the glitter of crystal and the weight of silence, the charity ball ceased to be a parade of vanity. It became an inverted courtroom where it was not Clara who was in the dock, but the entire elite who had dared to laugh at her. The silence after Ricardo's toast weighed like lead. His every word still echoed in the hall, leaving the guests somewhere between discomfort and shame. Some looked away, unable to face the cruelty reflected in his speech. Others tried to stand their ground, but their expressions betrayed their moral defeat. For once, Clara wasn't the target of judgment. They were. One of the women who had laughed the loudest minutes before tried to regain her composure. She approached Clara with a forced smile and murmured, "Honey, I hope you didn't take it the wrong way. It was just a joke." But her eyes wavered, filled with embarrassment. Clara didn't respond. She just held his gaze, and her silence was more powerful than any words. Another guest, a man who had earlier mocked the torn dress, cleared his throat and raised his glass to Ricardo. "Beautiful speech, my dear. Beautiful speech," he said, trying to mask his own embarrassment with empty praise. But no one paid him any attention. The weight of the truth still hung over everyone, crushing their gold and silk masks. Some tried to leave discreetly. Their hurried heels echoed on the marble like bells of defeat. Each exit was a silent acknowledgement that they no longer controlled the evening. The wounded pride of the elite was drained away in their hurried steps toward the doors, while Clara remained in the center of the room, standing firm, illuminated by the main chandelier. She, who had arrived with fear and shame, now radiated dignity. She didn't need to say anything. Her simple, upright posture was enough of an answer for everyone. Clara discovered in that moment that her strength came not from the clothes she wore, but from the courage to stand tall when the world wanted to see her fall. Ricardo, beside her, felt the transformation take place before his eyes. It wasn't just Clara who was reborn that night. He was too. The man who had always lived hostage to appearances was now freeing himself, facing the judgment of the elite without bowing his head. For the first time, he felt pride not in his own fortune, but in his choice to stand up for what was right. Among the remaining guests, some approached silently, bowing their heads slightly as a sign of respect. Small, discreet gestures, but they broke the rigid norm of that society. What had once been mockery now turned into recognition. Clara's humiliation had become an unexpected triumph. Clara felt her eyes well up, but she didn't cry. She held Ricardo's hand tightly, not as if leaning on someone, but as if sharing victory. It was the first time she didn't feel invisible. She was seen, recognized, and more than that, respected. That hall, which had previously seemed like a hostile battlefield, now became the stage for her silent victory. Ricardo raised his glass once more, not to toast, but to seal the moment. Justice needs no crowns or titles. An act of courage is enough to reveal the truth. His voice echoed through the hall, making it clear that the night had changed forever. And so, under the shamed gaze of some and the admiring gaze of others, Clara achieved what she had never imagined: a moral victory over those who had tried to crush her. It was the poetic justice that fate owed her, and which, at last, had arrived. The ball was no longer the same. What should have been a night of ostentation became a watershed moment. Clara, who had entered hiding her torn dress, now became a symbol of courage and dignity. The elite, who had once laughed, now fell silent, marked by their own embarrassment. Their silence was proof that something irreversible had happened. Ricardo beside her felt the weight of the consequences. He knew he would lose allies, contracts, and perhaps even prestige. But for the first time, he didn't care. The emptiness he'd carried for years had been filled by something greater: truth. The image of the cold, calculating man died there in front of everyone, giving way to someone who finally chose humanity over appearances. Clara took a deep breath, trying to believe what she was experiencing. She was no longer the invisible maid. She wasn't the young woman hiding in the corners of the mansion. That night, she had been seen, and more than that, she had been defended. That memory would remain forever, etched not only in her memory, but in the history of all who witnessed the moment. The remaining guests still stared at her, but there was no longer any contempt. Some expressed veiled admiration, others simply averted their eyes, unable to face their own shame. But no one dared laugh again. The torn dress, once a source of humiliation, was now a silent trophy of resistance. Ricardo turned to her and whispered, just for her to hear, "You changed tonight, Clara, and you changed me too." The words, simple, carried immense weight. Clara felt tears threaten to fall, but she held them back. She smiled, a small smile, but full of meaning. It was the end of an old pain, and the beginning of something new. The ball ended without applause, without traditional speeches. It ended with silence and uncomfortable glances, as if everyone there knew they had witnessed a quiet revolution. What should have been just another evening of luxury would be remembered as the night an invisible woman became impossible to ignore. As she left, Clara walked with firm steps. She no longer tried to hide her torn dress. On the contrary, she wore it like a banner. It was proof that, even scarred by humiliation, she had risen stronger. Ricardo accompanied her, and together they left the hall as victors of a battle they had never planned to fight. Outside, the cool dawn air enveloped them. Clara closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, as if finally freeing herself from a prison. For the first time, she felt like she had a future. She didn't know what would come, but she knew she would never be the same again. Ricardo also knew that night had changed everything. The man who would return to his mansion would never be the same. The masks had fallen, and he had no intention of picking them up again. For the first time he felt pride, not in his wealth, but in his choice to see someone the entire world had ignored. And so, under the stars shining in the silent sky, the two departed, not as boss and maid, not as millionaire and maid, but as two people transformed by the courage to face cruelty and by the audacity to truly see each other for the first time. Epilogue. That night, a torn dress revealed more than fragile seams. It revealed the cracks in a society that judges by appearance, but also the strength of a woman who refused to bow her head. Clara entered unseen and left unforgettable. Ricardo, who previously hid his humanity behind masks, discovered that true wealth lies not in gold, but in the courage to choose what is right. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson. In a world where so many wear shiny masks, it only takes an act of dignity to reveal who is truly strong. If this story touched you, please like it so more people can find it. Comment. True wealth is dignity, so we can show together that values aren't measured in clothes or money. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories that will touch your heart.